He asked only for a meal, but where he asked and how he asked would make the night remember itself. The Orpheum Hall shone like a practiced smile. Chandeliers scattered light like confetti. Men and women in tailored suits and silk dresses leaned toward one another over crystal, trading names and numbers as if they were currency. The printed program on every table read, Legacy for Veterans Gala in a font meant to sound permanent. At the archway, a thin line of dust traced his path across the marble. He moved forward with the hesitant certainty of someone who has walked too many miles to be startled by a room. A coat, worn at the elbows, hung on him like a curtain. Its patches told small stories of thrift and repair. His hair was a soft, unkempt crown, and his beard had the uneven patience of a man who sleeps where the world allows. His shoes left faint smudges, the kind the attendants will later try to buff away. In the pocket of that coat, a folded program peeked, an accidental bookmark to a life that had not entirely forgotten this place. He stopped near the stage. A Selmer Mark VI sat on a stand, lacquer catching the light like a mirror polished for worship. It was an instrument insured and catalogued, the sort of thing people whisper about over red wine. He looked at it the way someone might look at an old photograph, softly, not entitled. He put a hand to his mouth and spoke, the voice a weathered thing that held its own history. Could I play for a meal? Laughter answered first, the kind practiced by people for whom cruelty studies itself in a mirror. It was small and contained, the sort of laugh that feels like charity and lands like dismissal. One woman hid her amusement in her napkin. A man with a crisp cuff murmured, "Security," as if that single word could tidy a disruption. The crowd's amusement folded into a cautious ripple. A guard stepped forward, palms flat and professional, the slightest space kept between his body and the old man, as if proximity might contaminate the room. The guard's hand found the frayed fabric of the coat, a polite, defining touch that spoke louder than any shout. It was the single literal claim of boundary, an insistence that the night belonged to those who had paid for it. The room watched the moment, the way a theater watches a pause before the curtain. Someone said, with a soft, charitable tone meant to absolve, "We simply can't allow this. The sax is a rare piece, designer, vintage. We must protect it." The words were careful. Their politeness did the work of insult. Another voice, amused, added, "You wouldn't want a stranger handling something that's worth more than his life." He did not flinch when the guard's hand tightened against his sleeve. He did not beg. He reached for the sax the way someone reaches for an old friend's hand, like returning to a thing that once fit him perfectly. In that motion, there was no theatrical plea, only a quiet, inevitable reclaiming. Across the room, the woman whose name was on the programs watched, Evelyn Langford, whose smile cut like a well-honed statement. Her eyes measured the instrument as if it were museum property and measured the man as if he were a problem to be solved. When she spoke, her voice slid through the hall in a polished syllable. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, voice even and final, "that instrument is a Selmer Mark VI. It represents decades of craft. We cannot, in good conscience, allow someone from the street to place his lips on an object like that. It would be unhygienic." The words landed like a veil, soft, then suffocating. The guard's grip shifted again. For a heartbeat, the crowd held its breath, not because they feared him, but because they feared the discomfort of being wrong in public. He stood with the sax between him and the watching faces, the room leaning in to see what would happen. He breathed in slow, deep, the kind of breath a musician takes before a note he cannot let go of. Then he lifted the horn. Silence fell so complete that even the chandelier seemed to listen. The story of this night is just beginning in Orpheum Hall, but its echoes can reach anywhere. Where is this story finding you tonight? Let us know below, because the first note is coming, and when it does, this room will have to answer for what it just did. The silence did not last. Silence in a room like this is an invitation to decide, and they moved quickly to the decision they preferred. Evelyn Langford stepped forward with the kind of composure that had been paid for and taught. At 35, she wore command like a second skin, hair exact, dress designed to clear a space around her, a smile calibrated to disarm. She did not need to be loud. She only needed to be certain. "Let us not be cruel," she said, and the room softened the way a well-made napkin settles across a hand. "Tonight is for honoring those who served." Her sentence read like a program note, a line that both declared purpose and closed the conversation. Then she tilted, not abruptly, but with the practiced ease of someone who controls the tempo of a room, and the attention swung with her. "If you insist on performing," she continued as if improvising on an expected sentiment, "let's make it useful." Her hand slipped into a small clutch, produced a crisp bill, and laid it on the very edge of the stage where lacquer met light. The motion was an act of theater, precise and visible. $1,000, she said, and the number dropped into the air like a coin on marble. Let it be visible, a little incentive. The bill gleamed under the chandelier, not so much money as spectacle. It turned the wager from a verbal jest into a public object, measurable, auditable humiliation set in plain view. Evelyn's smile was mild, her intent was not. She had made the insult into a display. Murmurs threaded through the tables like a practiced understudy. "It will be a fine anecdote at next week's brunch," a woman said, voice honey smooth. "People will love to talk about it." A man near the front, cufflinks flashing, added, "It's a good experiment, curiosity with consequences." Another whispered, "Imagine dust on the keys, utterly improper." The language was soft, clinical. The cruelty was contained between polite clauses. Their words did more than judge. They exiled. The guard who had been watching from the wings moved forward with the bureaucratic certainty of someone enforcing a rule he had practiced on paper. His hand hovered near the frayed sleeve as if geography could define belonging. When his palm found the fabric, it was a touch that spoke ownership, a private law made public. In that slight, firm hold was the entire vocabulary of the room. Protect the property, manage the nuisance. At the edge of the room, observing with a mixture of dread and kinship, stood Tommy Blake. He wore a volunteer's vest because the university placed him there for the night, not because he wanted to be seen. In the pocket of his shirt, a folded photograph warmed against his ribs. His father in a creased uniform, half smile caught in grainy film. Tommy could still see the kitchen light from one night years ago. His father humming a single bar while fixing a loose hinge, humming until the boy's breath slowed. That single bar had been a hush that kept nightmares at bay. The memory was domestic and stubborn. Oil on hands, the smell of coffee, a humming lullaby that had steadied a body coming home from elsewhere. Tommy held the photo like a promise, thinking of how a tiny melody had once steadied a man who would not speak of what he had seen. Michael watched all of this as he always did, without theatrics, with method. He did not answer Evelyn's smile with words. Instead, he slid his hand inside his coat and closed his fingers around a dented, familiar mouthpiece he kept tucked there. The metal was cool against his palm, the kind of object that remembers the heat of long hours. He turned it in his thumb, a motion so small most of the room missed it. To Tommy, that motion read as ritual, routine practice made private, and it betrayed what their polite theories had not allowed. He had not come here to beg. Evelyn leaned into the room like a conductor inviting applause. "Let us see what art can do," she said, sweet and untroubled. "If we are moved, we give. If we are not, we learn the limits of sentiment." She tapped the bill with a manicured finger for emphasis, making the currency a prop in her demonstration. A man at the next table attempted a laugh that cracked into something sharper. "It's not really about him," he said. "It's about stewardship. We preserve, donate, protect." His words had the ring of policy, a white-collar rehearsal of morality. A woman near the center, perfectly coiffed, said, "An instrument like that is heirloom. You simply cannot let anyone handle valuables without stewardship." The line sounded reasonable until you heard how it landed, not as protection, but as distance. Another voice, softer, added what the others would not say aloud. "That horn could be worth more than some houses in this city." The sentence was casual, the implication grotesque. Money, here, had become the lens through which they judged human worth. The guard's hand tightened for a moment, an almost invisible pressure. For many in the room, the greatest crime was not that he had eaten on the street or that his coat was patched. It was that he introduced the possibility of discomfort into their curated evening. Michael moved then, not hurried, but purposeful. He stepped close to the sax the way a man returns to something he knows by touch. His fingers rested along the keys as if finding old friends. He ran a thumb along the mouthpiece he had carried, aligning reed and throat with a motion that was practice, not panic. The crowd misread that concentrated care for either incompetence or affectation. Tommy saw it for what it was, the quiet proof of repair and rehearsal, a lifetime's habit. A woman at the rear sniffed and said, "How untidy." The comment was pitched as a concern for presentation. It landed like a verdict. Another guest, smiling too broadly, murmured, "If he plays well, it will be a nice story. If not, well, security will have a gentler time next season." Their amusement was investment, and the room watched to see whether it would pay. Evelyn's gaze sharpened. She liked the way the moment tightened, the way attention threaded toward the stage like a bead on a wire. "Consider it performance art," she proposed, as if explanation could grant her cruelty cultural permission. "An experiment in empathy." Michael looked over the keys once more, felt the old shapes beneath his fingertips, the curve of the bell, the skin of the pads, the seasoned give of metal that remembers breath. There was something slight in his chest, not anger, but an exactness. He was about to do what he always had done, and in doing so, he would ask the room to do what it had practiced avoiding. Tommy's hand left the photograph and rested briefly against the table, as if steadied by the memory of the humming. He swallowed, not because he feared what was next, but because he understood it. Music had always been the shortest path to the truth. The guard's hold loosened. For a moment the room held its breath with the same anticipation as a crowd waiting for a curtain. The $1,000 bill glinted like a trap. They judged him twice, by coat and by color. Michael lifted the sax to his lips. He closed his eyes, and the sound of the room, the whispers, the crystal, the polite cruelty, vanished. There was only the cool metal against his lips and the waiting breath. He lifted the sax and arranged his hands with the same economy his fingers had learned in other rooms and other nights. There was no showmanship in his motion. It was habit, muscle memory that did not need applause. He placed the mouthpiece to his lips and breathed as if settling an old argument between ribs and air. The first phrase was small, almost private, two notes like a question. It wasn't a famous melody. It was the kind of tune you hear in kitchens and bunkers, a scratch of hope wrapped in the timbre of survival. This was the field tune, the scrap of music a comrade had written for him and folded into paper like a benediction. Michael had kept that tune not for its composition but for its promise. Play it and remember. When the note came, it did what true sound does in a room built on polite falsehoods. It filled space in a way light cannot. Laughter cut off mid-breath. Sentences evaporated. Glasses stopped clinking. The $1,000 bill on the stage blinked in the brass light like a guilty eye. For a moment, the hall held its breath. The instant people who had never been asked to examine themselves realized a test had begun they had not signed up for. The phrase was plain. Two notes, then a turn, then a return, like someone calling a name across a crowded street. It had no ornament, no bravado. Its power was the way it sat in the room like an undeniable fact. Those who had practiced not noticing the past suddenly found the past at their feet. Tommy felt it first in his chest, an almost physical tug. The photograph in his pocket warmed against his skin like an ember. He remembered sharply. The night his father hummed something similar while patching a radio. One bar repeated until sleep softened the edges of a nightmare. He saw the kitchen light, the smell of oil, the small tilt of his father's head as the man steadied himself with a melody. That tiny domestic picture cut through the polished sentences that had tried to exclude the past and made their cruelty visible in a way words could not. Tommy's throat tightened. For the first time that night, he pressed his thumb to the photograph and felt the pulse of memory. Faces around the room shifted. A woman who had been smirking pressed a napkin to her lips, as if to hide a sudden, awkward private sorrow. Men who had traded repartee now looked at their hands as if seeing them for the first time. The guard's jaw loosened. The bureaucratic certainty in his posture sagged into something like curiosity. The polite authority showed its first seam. Evelyn watched the change like a conductor noting an offbeat. Her smile thinned, but she did more than observe. She set her glass down with a motion slightly too firm. The crystal rang, an accidental, sharp chime that punctured the music. For a fraction of a second, her hand lingered on the stem as if she meant to steady herself, and everyone felt the glint of human imbalance in a woman who had practiced the appearance of control. It was a small thing, only a tightened knuckle, a barely audible clink. But the gesture revealed she was learning in real time that this was a performance she could not direct. Michael let the tune breathe and continue, each note conjuring images not of words, but of feeling, rain on canvas, the slow care of hands polishing brass by lamplight, remarks about value, once tossed off lightly, now hung in the air like accusations. Julian Prescott recognized the phrase as if it had the shape of a signature. He did not merely sit up straighter. He let his glass go unheard onto the table and pushed his chair back with a soft scrape. His hand went to his throat as if to clear one memory away, and another could be felt. He whispered, not quite a word, more a name, an intake that said he had heard the exact bend of a note he once knew too well. He rose from his seat a fraction, then another, eyes wet with a sudden, private astonishment. He rose from his seat a fraction, then another, eyes wet with a sudden, private astonishment. His face changed from polite curiosity into the kind of recognition that requires action. He moved forward as if the music itself had placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Look." The room answered in small human ways. A server paused mid-step, a tear tracking his jaw, a child asking a question without knowing why. Michael kept playing. There was no show in his face, no triumph in his mouth. He worked each phrase with the precise patience of someone who speaks by breath and key, and with every measured turn, the music claimed more of the space that money had tried to own. He cupped the bell and leaned into a long, slow sustain. The note hovered, an entire room balanced on a single vibration until people could not pretend to be anything but present. Evelyn's chin tightened, her fingers flexed, and for a moment she looked as if she might rise to interrupt. Instead, she let her hand fall, folding the impulse back into a practiced composure. Control, once lost, had been reclaimed, but the stumble had been seen. The phrase wound down into a long, aching hold. He released it slowly, then lifted his head and let the silence spread like the shadow of a hand. The first note had landed like a name. Something had woken in the hall. The second phrase widened the room, the way sunlight widens a photograph. Edges softened, shadows shifted. What had been background stepped forward. The sound rolled over tables and settled against shoulders that had been turned away from the world's harder edges. At first, people reached for explanations. "It's the acoustics," someone offered, then quickly added, "or maybe he just caught a lucky tone." The aside was meant to soothe, an attempt to turn discomfort back into tidy curiosity. But the note did not fit tidy. It carried a simple gravity that made excuses sound thin. A cluster of murmurs ran like a single current through the hall. "Imagine dust on the keys," one voice said. "Either way, it's memorable," another answered, as if memory could be boxed and catalogued. "He's clearly practiced," someone conceded, trying to save face for their earlier jokes. The language was designed to preserve distance, clinical, amused, safe. Tommy felt it first in his chest. The photograph in his pocket warmed. He remembered a single bar his father hummed while fixing a radio in the kitchen, light over a workbench, oil on fingers, a low, steady hum that put fear to sleep. That memory unclenched something in him. He pressed his thumb to the paper, let one small tear fall, and steadied himself with the hollow of his hand. The feeling was private and immediate, not performative. Faces changed in quick, human beats. A woman who had been laughing a minute before pressed her napkin to her mouth. A man who had been making remarks about provenance lowered his gaze and flexed his fingers, as if seeing them for the first time. The guard's posture eased. The official certainty in his shoulders softened into plain curiosity. Small, honest reactions, hands on hearts, averted eyes, quick, embarrassed wipes of the cheek, moved like ripples outward. Evelyn's composure showed its seam. She set her glass down a touch too firmly. The crystal clicked like a loose note. Her hand lingered on the stem as if to steady the tremor she felt but would not admit. The motion was small and human, more revealing than any speech she might make. For a moment, the room's polished surface reflected something unplanned. Michael moved from the field tune into a phrase that demanded more breath. The melody widened without hurry, each note placed as if crossing a narrow bridge. It was not showmanship. It was insistence. He threaded images into the sound. Rain on canvas, a zip of wind through a tent flap, hands carefully polishing brass by candlelight. Listeners did not see those images as description so much as memory making itself audible. In the middle row, a man who had earlier joked about value found his mouth empty. Another guest muttered, "He's only lucky this time." A final attempt to reclaim a sense of control. The remark landed thin and private, but it was enough to remind the wealthy that they could still frame the moment as they wished. The attempt to dismiss it only underscored what they already felt. Julian Prescott's reaction was quieter, more private. He did not call attention to himself. Instead, he leaned toward his wife and, in a voice barely meant for anyone but her, said, "That bend. It's the phrasing from the hospital concerts, isn't it?" He cupped a hand over his mouth as if to save the recognition from air. In the hush that followed, his eyes moved, and the sudden, almost startled acknowledgement on his face made him look older and more unsettled than his suit would suggest. The memory in him crept forward like a tide. In that private whisper, something shifted from personal recall to public consequence. The music kept speaking. Michael's hands worked with a surety that made the instrument say what needed saying. Where they had expected ornament, he gave them instead the language of restrained power. Longer lines, held notes that hovered and then resolved with the patience of someone accustomed to carrying others' silence. He cupped the bell and let a note hang until the air itself felt charged, until the room could not pretend to be anything but present. Small acts of human repair followed. A server paused to steady a tray and let tears fall unnoticed against a palm. A child leaned into a parent for a whisper without knowing why. Someone rose and, awkwardly, offered a napkin to a neighbor, embarrassed by the unexpected need for comfort. The $1,000 bill at the edge of the stage, once a spectacle, now looked obscene, its cheap gleam swallowed by the brass of the instrument. Tommy's response consolidated into one precise arc. The memory of his father's single humming bar, the kitchen light, the smell of oil, these formed a knot in his chest that untied into a single breath. He did not sob theatrically. He let one tear run, and then wiped his face with the back of his hand. He folded the photograph back into his pocket with a gentleness that felt like closing a book. The moment tightened him into readiness. He understood what this music could claim and what it might change. Evelyn's fingers flexed once more, an almost imperceptible tremor. She opened her mouth as if to shape a sentence that would pull the moment back into decorum, but no phrase came quick enough to settle the room. To the guests, trained to watch rather than feel, the pause looked like a failure of direction. Michael rose into a larger phrase. The notes climbed, not in speed for spectacle, but in density for truth. The hall leaned in as if the building itself had decided to eavesdrop. Light shifted in perception. The chandelier's gold softened into a warmer, more human glow. He did not stop. His shoulders, which had been slightly rounded with the weight of the lament, squared themselves. He took a deeper breath, not of sorrow, but of fuel. He threaded into a passage that felt like gathering air for a longer confession. A storm was coming. The storm began quietly, with a single shift in rhythm. The room didn't notice it at first. The change was too clean, too deliberate, like the brief tightening of a bowstring before release. Then came the leap. Notes cascaded from the saxophone like light through a broken window. Fragments, rapid, alive. They didn't so much arrive as collide, each one sparking against the next. The melody that filled the hall wasn't the gentle memory of a comrade anymore. It was giant steps, the test piece of legends, the kind of tune that turns fingers into blur and breath into fire. The first bars came fast enough to take the air with them. People stopped breathing for reasons they couldn't name. This was not charity, not nostalgia. It was command. He played as if gravity had been temporarily suspended, the kind of playing that folds years of discipline into seconds. The notes bent and spun and stacked until even those who knew nothing about jazz could tell they were witnessing something exact and irreversible. Evelyn Langford flinched first. Her control, so practiced and graceful, fractured in the smallest of ways. Her hand that had once ruled the room's rhythm now trembled against the back of her chair. A line of color crept up her neck. The heat of the music met the chill of her authority and found a crack. She tried to turn to someone nearby, to make a remark, but no words came. For the first time that night, her silence didn't sound powerful. It sounded small. The audience felt the same rupture in different ways. A man in the front row who once collected instruments blinked rapidly, trying to follow the flurry of sound with eyes that could never move as quickly as what he was hearing. Another whispered, "How is he doing that?" And the whisper spread, multiplying until it became part of the air itself. Someone laughed out of sheer disbelief, the kind of involuntary sound that escapes when awe and fear occupy the same breath. Michael didn't look at them. He wasn't playing for them anymore. He was playing through them. Each run of notes tore a narrow seam through the room's veneer and let something true and uncurated leak out. If the first tune had called up ghosts, this one let them speak. There was no plea in it, no performance of humility. It was defiance, discipline, and declaration. One man's resume written in sound. The saxophone's body glowed under the light. The keys flashed like quicksilver. His fingers a blur of practiced muscle. You could feel the pulse of his breath turning into structure, math and mercy at once. There was a geometry to the sound, spiraling, recursive, an architecture of exactness that refused to apologize for being brilliant. Each chord change felt like a turn in a story that had been waiting decades to be told. Tommy's heart hammered with the beat. He had studied Coltrane in textbooks, traced the impossible diagrams of harmonic shifts, but he had never felt it like this. This sense that a human being could carve space out of air. He pressed his hands together and thought of his father's quiet humming again. How that same breath could soothe. Now, the same language of breath was burning a cathedral into the silence. He smiled through tears, whispering to himself, "That's what healing sounds like when it fights back." The chandeliers above vibrated with the sound. Even the crystals seemed to shimmer differently. Waiters in motion stopped mid-step, their trays trembling just enough for glasses to touch. Somewhere near the center table a man muttered, "This can't be the same instrument," as if denial could preserve his ego. Another, unable to look away, said, "I've seen Coltrane play. No one does this anymore." They weren't wrong. He played the way a storm plays over water, relentless, fluid, inevitable. Julian Prescott, still standing near the aisle, wiped his face with a napkin that had forgotten its etiquette. He whispered again to his wife, "It's him. It has to be him." His tone was equal parts wonder and disbelief, the reverence of a man hearing history perform itself. When Evelyn caught the movement out of the corner of her eye, she shot him a look, part reprimand, part plea for composure. But even she couldn't meet the music's stare. Michael's eyes were half closed, his head tilting slightly as if listening to an invisible rhythm section that no one else could hear. Each breath came as a build, inhale, exhale, acceleration, until the hall was nothing but the pattern of his persistence. 10 seconds in, the line broke through into something transcendent, a run so clean and fast that it felt like language trying to catch up with feeling. For 10 seconds, they heard a life larger and more complex than any they had paid to ensure, a life they could not dismiss. When the run finally resolved, it didn't end, it landed. Like a body that had jumped and found ground, the final note struck deep and stayed there. The silence that followed wasn't polite this time. It was stunned, alive. Evelyn's breath trembled in her chest. She smoothed her dress with both hands, a reflex to reassemble her composure, but the motion was useless. Her image had cracked under the weight of something real. She looked at the $1,000 bill still lying at the edge of the stage, and for the first time seemed to realize how small it looked next to the sound that had filled the room. Her voice, when it came, was little more than a whisper. "How?" No one answered. The guard beside the stage had tears standing on his lashes. He blinked them away as if ashamed. The audience stayed seated, unable to applaud, unwilling to move. Polite society had lost its manners, and for once, that was grace. Tommy leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes wide. He wanted to remember every inch of this moment, not as a spectator, but as proof. He whispered under his breath, "Play, sir. Just keep playing." Michael did. He spun back into the theme with the quiet authority of someone reclaiming his own name. Each returning phrase reasserted who he was, not the homeless man they'd dismissed, but the master they'd forgotten. The melody curled upward and softened, easing from command into invitation. The room finally found air. Breaths exhaled. Someone at the back clapped once, just once, and then stopped, ashamed at the smallness of the gesture. And from the center table the whisper came, quiet, disbelieving, almost prayerful. It was Evelyn. "Who is he?" The question hung there, trembling between guilt and awe, like a confession wrapped inside wonder. If this moment moved you, hit like, it helps more people hear stories that matter. He lowered the sax just enough to breathe, then raised it again, eyes closed. The storm was not over. It was only gathering strength. He let the giant steps fall behind him and eased into something softer. Naima arrived slow, a melody that did not ask to be admired so much as to be heard. It reached into the room like a hand across an old wound, patient, exact, and without ornament. It made images appear in people's minds rather than explain them. Rain on canvas, a boot left carefully out of mud, the hush of men sharing a cigarette beneath a dim bulb. The music did not narrate, it summoned. Tommy felt it as a heat against his chest. The photograph in his pocket was suddenly warm as an ember. He remembered a single night, kitchen light, his father's oil-stained hands, the man humming one bar while tightening a bolt on an old radio. That small, steady hum had been a map back from fear when Tommy was a child. The memory folded into the notes and loosened something in his throat. He let one quiet tear fall and pressed his thumb to the photograph to remind himself that the feeling was real. Around the hall, a new atmosphere took hold. A woman's laughter was replaced by a napkin pressed to her lips. A man's jokes gave way to a lowered gaze. Even the guard's posture softened from policy into plain curiosity. Evelyn's control showed a seam. She rose as if to manufacture a statement, the movement calculated and quick. She set her glass down with a click meant to reclaim tempo. "Let us remember the dignity of the evening," she began, using her voice like a script. For a moment it seemed she might steer the mood back into polished charity, but the music had already rearranged things. A young server paused, eyes damp, and another guest, an older man by the window, stood before she could finish. He did not shout. He spoke simply and directly, voice steady in the hush. "Let him finish. We're here to listen." The request was not dramatic. It carried the weight of someone who had been given too few moments to be heard. The crowd shifted, and for the first time that night, did not reflexively follow Evelyn's lead. Her attempt to redirect the evening failed. Her smile thinned, then folded into a tight private expression. She sat back, hand still on the stem of the glass, as if learning that some evenings will not be choreographed. Michael played on. His tone softened and held, each phrase like a stitch closing a wound. The sax did not drown the memory. It made memory audible and unavoidable. The melody bent at certain places, an honoring of dissonance. And in those bends, the room found itself remembering more than it had intended. Julian Prescott felt the music in his ribs, the way an old map calls a man to a shore he thought forgotten. He leaned toward his wife and murmured, almost to himself, "That phrasing, field concerts, hospital rows, we heard that once." In that small admission, his posture changed from detached patron to witness. Someone near the back rose up slowly, an unassuming motion that carried a lifetime of small certainties. He did not stand to dramatize. He stood to say what needed saying. "I heard this on the ward the night my bunkmate didn't wake up," he said, voice low and precise. The sentence landed like a hinge swinging open. It gave a place and a time to the music, a reference that made the tune not only beautiful, but witness. The man's simple specificity changed everything. It turned private recall into public truth. Small confessions rippled through the tables, soft murmurs, half-sentences from those who had once heard that tune under different lights. The hall's curated comfort shifting under the weight of shared memory. Michael did not pause. He let the melody fold into itself and lengthen, phrases smoothing into holds that hovered above the hall like a question. He cupped the bell and let a long golden note hang until the room could not pretend to be absent. The note asked them to answer without speaking. It asked for recognition rather than applause. Tommy's tear was a single, steady line. He pressed his palm flat against the photograph and felt in that small contact something resolve into intent. The memory of his father's single bar had become language in a room that suddenly listened. He understood, with a new clarity, that music could be a tool of repair as much as a balm. The feeling did not end in sentiment. It moved him toward the thought of action. Evelyn's mouth opened as if to issue a corrective sentence, but the words caught. Her authority had no script for a room now awake with truth. The old man who had spoken sat down again, his quiet acknowledgment spreading through the hall like a verdict. The room felt audited, not by paperwork, but by memory. When Michael finally set the sax down, he did not speak in the way a performer thanks an audience. He said quietly and without flourish, "I played for promises kept." The sentence was thin but exact. For men, the world had forgotten. The words hung like a ledger left open. They were not a speech, they were an accounting. The silence that followed was work, not emptiness. People rearranging their thoughts to accommodate the fact that some debts do not fit a donation line. Someone, no flourish, just a man's needed clarity, rose and said, more specific and quieter than before, "I heard it on the ward the night my bunkmate didn't wake up." The room leaned into that particularity as if toward a light. Something had been woken, and it would not be sent back to sleep by applause. Sound had rearranged the room into a place that could hold contradiction. In the hush that followed the Naima phrases, small movements felt loud, and attention sharpened into something like exposure. Julian Prescott meant only to check a detail, a private curiosity stirred by phrasing. He pulled out his phone and typed the few letters that had lodged in his memory. The results populated the screen in a small, clear column. A headline, a thumbnail, a photograph that moved like a window. A young black man in uniform, sax at his side, eyes set the way the man under the chandeliers set them now. Michael Carter. Julian read the piece. Wartime concerts, hospital tents. A saxophonist who had been a nurse wrote, "The sound that kept us breathing." The story was a small archive of service. He looked up from the screen, letting the image on his phone and the man on the stage fold together in his mind. He'd come that night not to beg for food, but to see who would offer dignity and who would offer spectacle. The recognition was private at first, a catch of breath, the dropping of a program from his lap, and then it pushed outward. The room, already fragile with feeling, began to find history in the present. People leaned to see. A woman peered over Julian's shoulder and made a sound that was half gasp, half shame. The collector who had joked about provenance stared at the screen as if seeing an heirloom take human form. Evelyn noticed the shift in a way that read as a small personal panic. She stood and smoothed her dress with fingers that moved too quickly. A tremor she tried to keep private showed in the way she gripped her clutch so tightly the leather creased. For a moment she moved toward Julian as if to redirect attention, to produce some new line that would recenter the gala. Then she paused, saw the photograph, and her plan faltered. The rehearsed control she wore like armor became an awkward, inadequate thing. Her breath shortened, and a flush rose at her neck, a visible human unease that betrayed the fact she had not anticipated being upstaged by history. Michael's playing threaded those images into the room. Lamplit wards, men with bandages, a saxophone lifting a murmur into breath. The music made the past feel present as people watched history rearrange itself before them. Julian rose without ceremony. He crossed a few steps, not to interrupt, but to collapse the distance between memory and the man making it. He did not speak to the crowd. He spoke to Michael as if answering a private summons. "You played for them then," he said quietly. "You kept them breathing." Michael's fingers paused on the keys at that address, and in that small silence the room held a likeness. The face in the old photograph, the face under the chandelier, the same set of determination softened by years. Some people exchanged looks that had, until now, been avoided, an acknowledgement of being mistaken about the easy boundaries they had drawn. At the center of the room, Tommy watched everything with a kind of stunned clarity. He had felt the music as memory, had held the photograph of his father like a talisman. Now the archive on Julian's phone made the sweep of it literal. He studied the image, then looked at Michael, then at the $1,000 bill lying limp on the stage. The dissonance, mockery made physical beside a life of service, hit him with the pure force of recognition. Tommy rose, almost without thinking. His voice, when it came, had the clean, astonished honesty of someone who had not yet learned to hedge his questions. "Is he began, voice catching in the middle like a breath. "Is he the donor?" The question, coming from the margin of the room, small, innocent, and unarmed, landed with more force than any calculated whisper. It made the contradiction embarrassingly immediate. Could the man mocked as needy also be the one who had funded the very gala they attended? Heads turned. The $1,000 bill seemed to shrink. The idea unrolled across the tables like a rumor that could not be contained, forcing their evening into a sudden, discomfiting reshelving. Evelyn's face registered something like panic and calculation at once. Her hand fluttered toward the edge of the stage, as if to pick up the bill and make the humiliation literal once more, to reclaim the frame she had constructed. But she hesitated as if the historical fact on Julian's screen and the question from the youngest witness combined to block her momentum. Her mouth tightened. The little script she had prepared failed to place her back at the center. A murmur rose, not malicious now, but full of recalculation. "He could be," someone said softly at a near table. "I remember mention of a quiet donor," another offered, uncertain. Conversation, which had been banter and boundary, became speculation. Could the stranger be a benefactor, a silent underwriter of the very charity that now mocked him? Julian watched the room as it rewired. He did not answer Tommy's question outright. Instead, he kept his eyes on Michael and spoke to him again, this time as one witness to another. "My father told me stories about that music," he said, his voice thick with a history he now understood. "He said it kept them breathing. We should have known." Michael's hands moved again, and the music rose to meet the moment. The hall listened as if leaning into a revealed page. The photograph on Julian's phone seemed to close the distance between eras, making the past and present coterminous and forcing the room to answer what that meant for their evening of curated charity. His name had been in history, and now it stood before them. The room felt like a ledger that had been flipped open. Notes had settled, and the sums were visible. People who had come to witness generosity now sat with accounts to settle in their bones. Michael set the sax on its stand with the care of someone finishing a duty. The $1,000 check still lay at the edge of the stage, that small performative object Evelyn had made visible earlier. He looked around the room, slow and precise, and when he spoke, his voice had the calm of someone reading a balance. "You wagered a check to humiliate me," he said, letting the words land like a weight. "Many of you cried. By your rules, the bet was met. But I have given $10 million. $10 million to build what you claim to honor tonight. Real, accountable service for veterans." The words were not theatrics. They were a brief, exact accounting of intent. He named what the money would fund: transitional housing, mental health and trauma services, vocational training tied to real job placement, legal aid for benefits, and a scholarship fund that would include but not be limited to music therapy. He paused and met several faces in the room. Music therapy will be a priority within the program. We will train clinicians and hire graduates into paid roles. But this will not be a museum of pity. It will be a center run for veterans, by veterans, and publicly accountable. A few people exhaled as if realizing the scale. This was not a donation to paste a name on a plaque. It was a set of demands in the form of gifts. And, Michael continued, there are conditions: independent oversight, public reporting, veteran seats on the board, employment guarantees for graduates, scholarships with mentorship. The funds will be managed transparently, and the institution will answer to those it serves. He turned slightly to the money on the stage. And I will not take your $1,000 check. The refusal was precise. I refuse charity that comes garlanded with humiliation. The statement pulled a taut silence tighter. Evelyn's face went pale, then hot with a practical panic. Her fingers closed so tightly on her clutch, the leather creased. She opened her mouth to reframe the evening, then reached reflexively for her phone, a strategist mid-recalculation. But she stopped. The photograph on Julian's screen and Michael's calm resolve made any scripted salvage suddenly thin. Julian stepped up before anyone else could name the logistics. I will serve as interim chair, he said, voice steady. We will convene an independent oversight committee tomorrow. We will publish reporting timelines and ensure veteran leadership and governance. He did not grandstand. He offered a plan, concrete, immediate, and the room began to reshape into action rather than denial. Tommy folded the photograph in his hand so the image fit his palm and looked at Michael as if seeking permission and also confirmation. Sir, he said, I'm still in school. I haven't finished my degree. His voice held that mix of shame and hope that comes when an offer outpaces personal confidence. I don't know if I'm ready. Michael met him then with a steady kindness. Come work part-time at the center now. Help build the program while you finish school. When you graduate, your role can be full-time. We'll pay your tuition, and we'll pay your staff wage while you learn. The offer was practical and immediate. A bridge, not a handout. Tommy's face shuddered at first against doubt, then opened as if someone had eased a door. He nodded, barely, accepting the work and study compromise. A man who had treated the night as entertainment stared at the stage, whispering, 10 million. Michael's words returned to the room's moral center. This isn't about punishment, he said. It's about accountability. If institutions raise platters but leave people without roofs, the work must change. Evelyn's hand still trembled, but her mind was already working. She set her phone down, forcing a composure her body did not feel. Inside, the calculus was swift. Donor relationships, board chairs, the optics of resigning versus staying. Her expression, for a moment, was not one of defeat, but of a player assessing a new, more difficult board. She had to decide if staying meant a slow erosion of reputation or a chance to reclaim the game. As the room processed the conditions Michael had set, a slow, awkward movement spread. Some reached for napkins, others for hands across tables, gestures of repair rather than applause. No one clapped at first. What followed felt less like celebration and more like the beginning of a reckoning. Michael descended the stage and walked directly to where Tommy stood. He put a hand on the young man's shoulder with a gesture that was not theatrical but binding, the transfer of responsibility felt and explicit. Julian already had his phone out, drafting a list of the first committee names. The center of the night had moved from spectacle to governance. Evelyn sat very still. The light from the chandeliers painted her face in gold. The shadow from the stage cut across it like a stripe of truth. For a strategist used to scripting outcomes, the visible contrast, glittered control on one side, a darker, quieter account on the other, felt like exposure. Her eyes tracked Michael as he spoke with Julian. She weighed the options of stepping back or fighting to stay. That internal ledger had no immediate announcement, only the raw question, what will she decide to do next? Judge by heart. The next morning felt less like recovery and more like the opening move of work. The gala lights were cold now, but the decisions made under them carried their own heat. Emails arrived. Calls were returned. People woke to the ledger the music had left open. Evelyn Langford did not disappear. She stayed long enough to make a visible choice. Standing before the gathered staff and a small cluster of veterans and donors, she said plainly, "I will step down from the gala committee." Her voice was steady, but not theatrical. "I will join the oversight board and enroll in the training program the center will run. I will learn what we did not know." It was both an admission and an action, visibility in place of retreat. Julian accepted the interim chairmanship with practical language. "We'll form an oversight committee tomorrow," he said. "No more ceremonies without results." Michael's gift was wired into a fund with clear stipulations: housing pilots, trauma-informed care, vocational pipelines, and a scholarship endowment that included paid internships. The money was structured for impact, not just headlines. Michael's approach to stewardship was quickly revealed. At a planning table, he suggested funding existing veteran-run organizations rather than building a new bureaucracy. He insisted on phased funding tied to clear metrics: housing opens, then clinical teams hired, then jobs confirmed, ensuring the money would be a durable engine, not a one-night headline. His generosity came with the practical constraint of responsibility. Tommy Blake, at first hesitant due to his studies, accepted Michael's offer. A part-time role now, tuition support, and a pathway to full-time work. "Come help us build it," Michael had said. "Learn the systems. When you're ready, step up." Tommy's yes was quiet but resolute, his fingers folding the photograph of his father with a new steadiness. The center's first week was not glamorous, but necessary work: leases, audits, and systems. Julian published the oversight charter, while Evelyn attended training sessions, listening awkwardly but sincerely. Progress was measured in small partnerships: local employers agreeing to hire graduates, a university linking internship credits, a clinic offering sliding scale services. Michael's role became one of strategic oversight. He let leaders with lived experience take charge, but would course correct when necessary. When a manager proposed an expensive brand campaign, he asked softly, "How many beds does that buy?" When a contractor proposed an ornate lobby, he suggested funding case managers instead. His choices were a moral arithmetic: people over presentation. Word spread not by press releases, but through networks. A caseworker tipped a veteran to an opening, a professor placed an intern. The work multiplied in quiet, practical ways as the scholarship and vocational programs placed graduates with employers who had partnered with the center. Tommy's path unfolded gradually. He clerked part-time, apprenticed under senior clinicians, and when he graduated, he took a full-time role coordinating community music programs and overseeing therapy placements. He learned grant writing and the bureaucratic patience that sustains nonprofit work. Sometimes in slow moments, he would hum the single bar his father had once hummed to steady a child through a storm, and a veteran in the corridor would hum back. Evelyn's days were not easy. She answered hard questions from oversight and opened financial decisions to public audit. She chose to stay and be accountable. Over months, her consistent presence at community sessions softened suspicion into cautious trust. The transformation was not complete, but her presence mattered more than any statement. Michael returned to the hall once more for a modest opening of the first housing pilot. He played a short phrase, nothing showy, and watched how the room listened differently now. After the ribbon cutting, a veteran leader asked him a technical question about funding disbursement. Michael answered in plain terms about cash flow timing and contingency reserves, his voice practical and clear. That exchange, him speaking about covenants and trust accounts, was the kind of quiet proof of stewardship the center needed. The donor who understood that money without structure often fails the people it intends to help. At a small evening ceremony some months later, he lifted the sax one last time in that hall. The note he played was neither triumph nor elegy. It was an attendance. In the crowd, Tommy watched with a steadiness that matched the new life forming around him. Evelyn stood at the back, hands open instead of clenched, the chandelier light drawing soft lines across her face. She had stepped into the work, not to hide, but to learn. Judged by heart, the refrain returned as an instruction rather than a slogan. The work would continue, tedious, faithful, necessary, and the gauge of success would be in the everyday acts of repair, beds filled, cases closed, jobs started, therapy sessions scheduled. If you believe dignity still matters, subscribe JusticeSoul for more stories of faith and justice. The sax's last note thinned into the hall and folded into night. The doors closed softly. Outside, the city turned on. The question remained: would the memory of that evening carry into tomorrow, or would it be another story folded away? The work would tell,